The impact had already ripped the airplane apart by the time the first firefighters reached the wreckage. But in the middle of the burning debris field, one small voice was still alive. Northwest Flight 255 had come down beside Middle Belt Road in Romulus, just after takeoff from Detroit Metropolitan Airport on the night of August 16, 1987. The MD-82 had slammed through a light pole, clipped the roof of a rental car building, broken apart across the road, and exploded into fire. Cars were crushed. Pieces of the cabin were scattered across pavement, grass, and twisted metal. Most of the people on board were gone in seconds. Then a firefighter heard a sound that did not belong in a place like that. It was a child. She was 4 years old. Her name was Cecelia Cichan, a little girl from Tempe, Arizona, traveling home with her parents, Michael and Paula, and her 6-year-old brother, David, after a family trip east to visit relatives. When rescuers found her, she was still strapped into her seat. The seat was upside down. Her body was burned, cut, and broken, but she was alive. At first, some responders thought she must have been a child from one of the cars on the road, because almost nobody looking at that wreck believed a passenger from the airplane could have survived it. They were wrong. Cecelia was the only person on the jet who lived. Northwest Flight 255 was a scheduled run from Minneapolis to Phoenix, with stops in Saginaw and Detroit. By the time it prepared to leave Detroit that Sunday evening, there were 149 passengers and 6 crew members on board. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, and there was nothing outwardly dramatic about the departure. Families were settling in for the last leg. Business travelers were expecting a routine flight. The cockpit crew had flown together before. Captain John Mouse was 57 years old and experienced. First Officer David Dodds was 35. Outside it was warm and hazy, the kind of evening when people expected an ordinary takeoff and a dark sky over the suburbs a few minutes later. The trouble started on the ground, long before the airplane left the runway. Flight 255 was cleared to taxi to runway 3C, the shortest of the airport's main departure runways that night. During taxi, the crew missed a turn and had to ask for help getting back on the proper route. That was not fatal by itself, but it added to a cockpit workload that the NTSB later concluded had already become fractured. Essential checklist discipline broke down. The MD-82 needed its flaps and slats extended before takeoff. That did not happen. The airplane rolled toward departure with its wings still configured for a clean, high-speed shape instead of a takeoff setting. In a jet like that, on a runway like that, carrying that weight, the margin for error was tiny. At 8:44 that night, the airplane was cleared for takeoff. A little more than 2 minutes later, it accelerated down runway 3C and lifted off. From the tower and from the ground, the departure looked wrong almost immediately. The nose came up, but the airplane did not climb the way it should have. Witnesses later described it staggering into the air, wings rocking, engines screaming. Inside the cockpit, the crew had only seconds to understand what was happening. The airplane reached only a low altitude. Then the left wing dipped. The jet began rolling. It never recovered. The MD-82 struck a light pole on airport property about half a mile beyond the end of the runway. It continued forward, hit the roof of an Avis rental car facility, and then smashed into vehicles on Middle Belt Road before breaking apart in a fireball. The crash killed 154 people in all, 148 passengers and all 6 crew members aboard the aircraft, plus 2 people on the ground. 5 others on the ground were injured. It was the deadliest aviation disaster in Michigan history and the worst crash in Northwest Airlines history. In the middle of that destruction, Cecelia survived with third-degree burns and fractures to her skull, collarbone, and left leg. She had no memory of the crash itself. What followed was a child's body trying to live through a catastrophe adults could barely comprehend. She was taken to the hospital in critical condition. For days, the country watched updates on the little girl who had come out of a wreck that looked unsurvivable. Around her, the grief was almost impossible to contain. Her mother, father, and brother had all been killed. Other families were still waiting for identifications, funerals, and explanations. Cecelia woke into a world where the people who should have been at her bedside were gone. The investigation quickly focused on the airplane's takeoff configuration. The evidence was blunt. The flaps and slats had not been set for departure. Without that extra lift, the airplane could leave the ground only briefly before aerodynamics and drag caught up with it. The NTSB found that the probable cause was the flight crew's failure to use the taxi checklist and their failure to extend the flaps and slats for takeoff. The investigation also found a contributing factor that deepened the horror of the case. The airplane's takeoff warning system, which should have sounded an alarm when the throttles were advanced with the jet improperly configured, did not provide the crew with an oral warning. Electrical power to the central warning system was not available for reasons the investigation could not determine with certainty. One of the dead was Phoenix Suns center Nick Vanos, 24 years old, flying home before the new NBA season. Many of the passengers were from Arizona, which is why the loss hit so hard there as well as in Michigan. At the crash site near Interstate 94, responders worked in heat, smoke, and wreckage that stretched across a public road. They found burned luggage, torn seat frames, and pieces of family vacations thrown into weeds and pavement. For the firefighters and police officers who were there, Cecelia's survival became the one fragile fact that kept the scene from feeling completely beyond human reason. Her own story did not become easier because she lived. She underwent months of treatment and recovery. The physical scars remained. So did the emotional weight of being the only survivor. After the crash, she went to live with relatives in Alabama, far from the place where strangers still recognized her from old magazine covers. As she grew older, she learned the story the rest of the country had already attached to her name. She learned what had happened to her family. In later years, she largely protected her privacy, speaking only occasionally about the burden of carrying a disaster that she had been too young to remember, but old enough to inherit for life. The crash also changed aviation. Northwest Flight 255 became one of the central case studies in checklist discipline, cockpit breakdown, and warning system reliability. It was not just a story about one crew making one mistake. It was a story about how distraction and a missing safety barrier could line up in less than 3 minutes and destroy an airplane filled with ordinary people. The takeoff roll began as one more departure from Detroit on a summer evening. By the time the wreckage stopped burning, 156 people were dead. 2 families on the ground had been torn apart, and a little girl had been left to survive a loss so total that most adults could not even describe it without stopping. What made Cecelia's survival so haunting was not only that she lived, it was that she lived through something that erased everything around her. In that field of wreckage beside the road, the airplane had failed, the checklist had failed, and the warning had failed. Yet one small seat, one small body, and one thread of life remained. That is why Flight 255 stayed in memory long after the fire was out. At its center was a child who came back from it alone. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.